Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're stepping into the high-stakes, pretty uncompromising world of environmental management. We're going to be looking specifically at ISO 14001-2026, Clause 8.2, and we'll be doing it through a very specific perspective, the critical lens of a lead auditor. Now, this clause is all about emergency preparedness and response. It's basically where organizational promises meet the chaotic reality of an actual crisis. We're going to break down exactly what an auditor looks for to make sure a facility is truly prepared to protect the environment when things go horribly, horribly wrong.
Here's the roadmap for our journey today. We'll be hitting identifying emergencies, planning for the worst, auditing completeness, approval and control, and finally wrapping up with communication and failures. Let's get right to it.
I want you to keep this question in the back of your mind as we go through this explainer, because honestly, it's the ultimate test. It's one thing to have a beautifully formatted, perfectly bound document just sitting safely on a manager's shelf collecting dust. It's an entirely different thing to have a system that holds up when alarms are blaring, chemicals are spilling, and panic is setting in. You see, an auditor's job isn't to check if you have a pristine piece of paper. It's to figure out if that piece of paper will actually act as a shield against severe ecological damage, massive legal penalties, and major operational disruption.
All right, before we go any further, we need to establish our baseline vocabulary. When ISO 14001-2026 talks about environmental emergency scenarios, it specifically means sudden, uncontrolled, or unexpected events that have the potential to cause significant environmental harm. We're moving far beyond generic workplace safety here. So we aren't just talking about a standard Tuesday morning fire drill. We're talking about serious, site-specific threats. Think of a massive chemical spill, a toxic fire, an explosion, or maybe an unexpected release of hazardous wastewater straight into a local river. These are high-risk situations that require highly specialized responses.
Okay, let's dive into this. There is a really stark difference between basic safety compliance and the deep, risk-based environmental thinking strictly required by Clause 8.2. A generic response plan might just say, hey, in case of fire, evacuate the building. But an ISO 14001 risk-based plan, it asks entirely different questions. It asks, while the building is burning, what exactly happens to the hazardous solvents stored inside? How do we contain the contaminated firefighting water so it absolutely doesn't drain into the groundwater? How do we manage the toxic gas leak? The auditor expects you to anticipate these environmental consequences, for sure, not just the safety ones.
And this builds into what auditors call the cascading effect. It's kind of like a giant domino effect. The source material emphasizes that risk-based thinking requires organizations to anticipate how one emergency triggers another. Consider this vivid worst-case scenario. A warehouse catches fire. That's bad enough on its own, right? But the fire releases toxic fumes into the air, a secondary environmental impact. Then, emergency responders arrive, they pump thousands of gallons of water to put out the fire, and that water mixes with chemicals in the warehouse. Now you've got highly contaminated runoff flowing directly into a nearby river. An auditor actively looks for this level of worst-case cascading thought during the planning phase. If your plan stops at just putting out the fire, you've already failed the audit.
So how does an auditor actually systematically evaluate a response plan? Well, they use a strict completeness checklist. They want to ensure the plan identifies all site-specific scenarios. No generic templates allowed. They check if emergency roles are clearly defined, so everyone knows exactly who's in charge of containment. They look for the allocation of tangible resources, meaning, do you actually have the spill kits and monitoring devices you claim to have? They verify established communication channels, and crucially, they check if the plan actually mandates post-incident reviews so you learn from your mistakes. If any of these are missing, the plan is just incomplete.
This is exactly why generic one-size-fits-all templates will automatically fail an audit. Clause 8.2 demands that plans be uniquely tailored to an organization's specific operational context. To put that into perspective, a mining operation has to plan for a tailings dam failure and severe groundwater contamination. A logistics company? They need to be ready for hazardous material transport accidents on the highway. Or a pharmaceutical plant, they must have protocols for the accidental release of active ingredients into the wastewater system. The auditor expects your plan to reflect your actual reality, not some theoretical baseline.
So the crucial point is that creating this plan is not just an administrative exercise, it's about rigorous governance. This is the document control lifecycle. You draft the plan based on those risk assessments we just talked about. Then it has to be reviewed by actual technical experts, environmental specialists, safety pros. But step 3 is absolutely vital: top management approval. An auditor checks for this executive signature because it represents genuine leadership commitment and actual resource allocation, not just bureaucracy. Finally, the whole thing enters strict version control.
You might be wondering, why are auditors so obsessed with document control and versioning? Well, it's a very simple cause and effect reality. Imagine a rapidly escalating crisis. A chemical tank has just ruptured. A worker grabs the emergency manual off the wall, but wait, it's an outdated version from 3 years ago, well before the containment systems were upgraded. They follow the wrong procedure, the response is delayed, and the environmental damage literally multiplies. Auditors check document control because using the wrong manual during a crisis is a very real and very preventable disaster.
Next up, the auditor will thoroughly scrutinize your communication web. Clause 8.2 requires a highly detailed protocol. We're not just talking about telling your employees to evacuate. You need internal escalation protocols. You need immediate alerts for local communities who might be breathing in toxic smoke. You need seamless coordination with external emergency services. You have strict timelines for reporting to regulatory authorities. And here's a step a lot of organizations actually miss. You must brief external contractors working on your site. An auditor is going to check if every single one of these stakeholders is accounted for in your communication plan.
This brings us to the massive gap between theoretical communication and practical readiness. Having a list of phone numbers printed in a dusty binder is theoretical. I mean, it looks great on a desk, but practical readiness, which is what ISO 14001:2026 actually requires, means you have tested hotlines. It means you use digital alerts that notify the right teams instantly. It means your contractors were actually briefed on your emergency procedures before they ever step foot on your site. The auditor wants to see that your communication system is a living, fully functional tool. And this brilliantly illustrates what happens when these practical elements are missing. Audits fail. In fact, there are a few highly common nonconformances found in Clause 8.2 audits. A massive chunk of failures comes from a sheer lack of drills and testing. Organizations also fail a lot because they use generic, unidentified scenarios like we talked about earlier. Communication breakdowns during simulated emergencies, another huge red flag. Finally, outdated document approvals, where management hasn't even looked at the plan in years. That will guarantee a nonconformance for sure.
Let's focus on that first major failure for a second, a lack of drills. Listen, an auditor's not going to just take your word that your plan works. No way. They expect to see hard proof that a documented plan has been rigorously validated. They want to see records of simulated drills, complex tabletop exercises, and scenario-based assessments. If your plan says you're going to deploy spill kits to contain a solvent leak, the auditor wants to see the records of the drill where your team actually opened the spill kits and deployed them against a ticking clock. The plan absolutely must hold up under simulated stress.
But, the process doesn't just end when the drill is over or when a real emergency is contained. Clause 8.2 demands a strict post-incident review cycle. First, obviously, you contain the emergency. Second, you evaluate the actual environmental impacts. Did pollution reach the soil or the water? Third, you conduct a root cause analysis to figure out why the incident happened in the first place and where the response fell short. Fourth, and this is the absolute key for the auditor, you must update and improve the plan based on those lessons. The auditor verifies that you actually learn from your mistakes to continuously level up your defenses.
There's a quote from the source text that just hits the nail on the head here. It says, "The effectiveness of an emergency response framework is not solely determined by how well an organization reacts, but by how thoroughly it evaluates and improves its system after the incident." True environmental preparedness isn't just a static document. It's a living, breathing cycle of continuous improvement. The goal isn't just to scrape by and survive an audit. It's to build a resilient, adaptive system that genuinely protects the environment.
So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to take away from our explainer today. If an unexpected, worst-case environmental emergency struck your facility today, like right now, would your documented plan act as a lifeline, guiding your team to mitigate the disaster? Or would it just be a liability, an outdated, untested piece of paper that fails when you need it the most? Because that is the exact question an ISO 14001 lead auditor is going to ask you. Make sure you have the right answer. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep learning.